Welcome back to the School of Muscle podcast today. Alec joins me, and he recently authored a really interesting study on cold water immersion and the effects that has on hypertrophy. And I will have that linked in the description box below. And the place I'd like to start here, Alec, is just first off, what kind of led you wanting to do this meta-analysis? And then also if you could maybe just briefly cover like what a meta-analysis is and maybe the high-level difference of between that and just like a regular study, that would be great as well.
So this was actually I'm in the master's program at Lehman College in Human Performance and Fitness. And this was done as part of an independent study class. Everyone kind of put their ideas in the hat, and mine was chosen. So that's what we went forward with. Personally, I was interested in cold water immersion though, probably for like 3 reasons. A few years ago when like Wim Hof took off, and everyone was getting into like the cold water craze. I jumped in with that too. And more recently, there's a cold plunge at my gym. So the first year I signed up, I used it like a fiend. Like every session, it was sitting in there for, I get up to like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, see how far I could push it. I was thinking mainly about recovery, but I guess hypertrophy was in the back of my mind a little bit. Second reason was probably, so one of the co-authors on this paper, Joseph Gurgic, he published a meta-analysis about a year before on muscular strength adaptations in cold water immersion. He looked at both partial body, so single limb submersion, and total body, but didn't look at hypertrophy specifically. So this was kind of a logical missing piece to go with. And I guess the third reason was it's just like super popular in the fitness community. It's a buzzword. There are memes. Like, how do you know someone does cold plunges every morning? Don't worry, they'll tell you. So that seemed like a good direction to go.
Absolutely. So it was something that you were personally interested in. You also kind of filled a kind of gap in the literature a little bit there. And then also it's just kind of a popular topic. And I like that you mentioned that because the first thing that anybody will tell you is that if they're morning routine, that they do cold water immersion or something like that. So kind of with that, I think you're going to continue there maybe on the difference between kind of what you guys did here versus a just kind of typical study.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who don't know, a meta-analysis is basically the idea is to compile a whole bunch of research that's been carried out and to pool those effects. So taking the results of each of those studies, putting them together and see if we can come up with a kind of conclusion or at least draw inferences that we wouldn't get maybe with like an exercise science. A lot of the studies are super small, right? Not very many participants. And so this is very valuable, being able to put together all this information from the smaller studies into larger data points and data sets. You gather those, the effects and the results of those studies, you apply a bunch of fancy or not fancy to stats, depending on who's doing it. And then you come up with an assessment of whatever the question of interest is.
If I was doing it, definitely not very fancy stats. That is for damn sure.
I can mention later. I'll talk a little bit about the stats, but that's definitely not my area of expertise.
Mine as well. I remember taking like advanced statistics courses for my master's program, and I was just like, man, I knew enough to get through the classes, but like if I had to go back to some of that information right now, I'd be like pretty murky with it.
Well, they'll say like as soon as you're out of the class, it's gone.
Absolutely. The kind of unfortunate reality of a lot of classes you take kind of throughout your academic journey. So kind of with that, Alec, what was kind of the purpose of the study? It might be a little bit kind of self-evident regarding the title of the study includes cold water immersion, the effects on hypertrophy, but what was kind of the overall purpose of the study?
Yeah, simply put, we were looking at post-training cooling in combination with resistance training versus resistance training on measures of muscle growth on hypertrophy.
Perfect. And what were your kind of expectations heading into this study? Did you have certain, biases towards you thought it would help, you thought it would hurt, or what were you kind of thinking kind of heading into this? Maybe based on some other research by, I'm going to start with pronouncing his name, I think Gurgic, some close to that. Yeah. So yeah, what were your kind of expectations heading in?
So I guess that's a good inroad. So Joseph Gurgic had found that there were muted strength adaptations when there was partial body, so single limb submersion. People didn't get as strong with cold water as without. But for whole body submersion, there seemed to be similar strength gains. So I thought that was interesting. We didn't, I know most randomized control trials, most studies will state a hypothesis. We didn't state a hypothesis for this. Personally, I assumed that we'd see less growth. One of the reasons is there's a whole bunch of physiological processes that happen, right, when we do resistance training, when we're in the gym. And there's been a lot of research on downregulation, so suppressing of like mTOR pathways, ribosome biogenesis, muscle protein synthesis, satellite cell activity, circulating testosterone. So a lot of these acute things that we think over time probably lead to muscle growth. So if cold water is going to suppress that, it would probably make sense that if you add those up over time, it would suppress hypertrophy. Now that's not always the case. A lot of times acute reactions, especially in hypertrophy and similar fields, similar topics, don't really have an impact in the long run. There's also the kind of like visceral knee-jerk reaction that it makes sense if you're diminishing blood flow to muscles that were just working, probably they're not going to be getting what they need to recover and adapt to the stress, or maybe not even realize that there is the stress, whatever. Of course, feelings would never factor into a researcher's thought processes. But that's why we have to carry out the study to see what actually what comes out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And in your defense, I just asked you, like, what were your kind of personal expectations, not necessarily based on anything hard. So yeah, absolutely agree. And like you said, just because there's some acute changes doesn't necessarily lead to long-term applied outcomes. Like one example that comes to my mind is, I believe there's research on like if someone does heavy compound lifts that they get acute kind of increases in testosterone, but that doesn't always kind of pan out to lead to more muscle growth over the long term. So sometimes those kind of acute physiological changes can be a little bit misleading. So definitely good that we have this study here. So kind of moving forward into that, what were your guys' inclusion criteria for this, or what sort of studies did you decide to include in this analysis?
Yeah, so when we first started out, we were looking for cold application of any kind. So we kind of cast a pretty broad net. It happened that all the studies that met all of the inclusion criteria were cold water immersion. But we were looking for studies that were between 4 and 12 weeks. We wanted to make sure that these were healthy adults. They could be resistance trained or untrained. As it happened, it broke down a pretty even split, which was cool. What else did we look for? Well, obviously there had to be cold water immersion. So cold water immersion in combination with resistance training, compared with resistance training and either like sitting still or sitting in, room temperature water, or maybe cycling gently, something like that. So yeah, that's what we were looking for. I guess one last one, they had to measure muscle growth, right? That's the key. So this wasn't performance outcomes. So we were looking for studies that utilized ultrasound, CAT scans, MRIs, biopsies. Yeah. And
was there a certain like length of immersion that they had to be immersion for? I definitely didn't put that sentence together very well.
No, that we didn't set any limits on that. As it turned out, all of our studies fell between 10 and 20 minutes of immersion. And they were all in there within 15 minutes of finishing the training session.
Awesome. Well, I think that kind of gives a good overview of the kind of studies you include. So now to kind of get to the good part, what did you guys kind of find here? What were kind of some of the main results?
Yeah, so we were looking for the effect sizes, right? Our statistician, Paul Swin, he applied Bayesian stats. So not using kind of the cutoff that we're used to seeing in a lot of papers, the p-value of less than 0.05. We were looking at really at the meaningful changes and differences in the hypertrophy outcomes. So to give a quantitative kind of cutoff to what I'm about to say in terms of the small, medium, and large effects, we are looking at 0.1 for small, 0.35 for medium, 0.7 for large, when looking at just the hypertrophy outcomes. And I can explain a little bit about the difference, but so we looked individually at resistance training. Was there muscle growth there? We looked at resistance training plus cold water immersion. Was there muscle growth there? And then we compared those results together. Why is this important? because it seems like kind of the same thing at first. It actually kind of speaks to the efficacy of the protocol. So we wanted to see, okay, we're about to test and find out whether cold water attenuated these hypertrophy results, but let's see if the protocols were actually effective in their own right before we go ahead and jump to that conclusion. So we found that hypertrophy on their own, there was at least a small effect size of just the resistance training, so a range of between 0.1 and 0.61 probably. For the CWI groups, we found an effect size of negative 0.08 to 0.36. So likely between no effect and maybe a small effect. And then when we were comparing the resistance training alone versus CWI effect sizes, we found a negative 0.47 to 0.04 range, meaning that cold water immersion, at least applied in this way, probably had a small effect on hypertrophy compared to not getting in the cold water.
Absolutely. So it had a small kind of negative effect towards growing muscle. So the individuals that, hopped into cold water immersion for that roughly 10 to 20 minutes within like 15, 20 minutes of their workout, those individuals experience kind of small to moderately less kind of hypertrophy compared to those that just did their program and didn't do any cold water altogether. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, that's about right. Also, the cold water, I don't know if I mentioned before, but all the studies were between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius, which is like 50 to 59 degrees Fahrenheit, which doesn't sound that cold. It's certainly not an ice bath. But if you think of like a comfortable pool temperature is like 78 degrees, that's almost a 20 degrees difference. That's big.
Yeah. And so I grew up kind of close to the Mississippi River, so we would occasionally go boating and stuff like that. And if you ever saw like the boat has the water temperature, if you ever jump in the water when it's like in the 50s, it is super cold. Like, I don't think people realize, like, if you're used to warmer temperatures and you jump into 50-degree water, it is actually like, remarkably chilly. So did the results kind of surprise you at all? It sounds like they were more or less in line with your expectations, or were there any kind of surprising findings for you?
No, I mean, I think sort of would probably be comforting to a lot of people is that, we did find, because of that analysis, analyzing them separately, cold water and resistance training, and seeing if the protocols themselves were effective. It was surprising. There was still some muscle growth in cold water immersion groups, just not as much as without. But by and large, the results pretty much lined up with what I expected, certainly. I think what a lot of the co-authors did too.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important takeaway as well. Is it's like, as with a lot of things that can kind of blunt hypertrophy a little bit, I'm also thinking of like NSAIDs or something like that. It's often not the case to where it just like completely ameliorates hypertrophy altogether. Like, usually there's still some hypertrophy that occurs. It's just not, quite as effective as if you didn't do these modalities. So like, if someone occasionally did a cold water bath following their training, and maybe they did it a couple times a month, I would struggle to see like really meaningful differences with that. But, to me, this is just like, hey, maybe don't consistently do cold water immersion after every single training session or something like that. So, for one, does that sound like a fair assessment? And for two, did you have any other just kind of, practical takeaways for someone when considering, they want to get as jacked as possible, but maybe they're also interested in cold water immersion? Do you have any kind of practical takeaways there?
I think that's a great caveat. And I think that's certainly that it's one that people raise with cold water immersion research in general. It's like, okay, but there are like many different cold water immersion strategies. I'm only doing it when I wake up in the morning. I'm only doing it like 4 hours later. I'm only doing it every other day, or, whatever it is. And so I think that there are kind of a few different ways to look at it. One is, look, this is, like you said, if you're jumping in the cold water right after you train, every time you train, you're probably not going to get as jacked as possible, as quickly as possible. You'll probably still see some muscle growth. It just won't be as efficient as you might want. There are plenty of other reasons to use cold water immersion probably. Things like recovery, especially if you're like in the middle of a competition and have to repeat an effort the same day or the next day, things like that. It's been shown to be great for that. So I think the cold water use that was explored in the studies we analyzed, I think there is some ecological validity there. I think this is a realistic application for some people. And so I think some people will find it immediately applicable to what they do. But yeah, I think you can kind of file it under the column of maybe think twice between doing it regularly. There's also the idea of, because this is a meta-analysis, it's kind of at the top of the hierarchy of evidence-based practice. So it's a combination of all these other randomized control trials. Obviously, if we're looking to be evidence-based practitioners, be it coaches, if we're training ourselves, giving advice, science communicators, anything like that, we do need to combine, meta-analyses, individual studies, anecdotes, personal experience, expert consensus. So we just need to make sure that we give appropriate weight to all of those.
Awesome. And, another kind of strategy that people kind of often employ, and I'm not sure if you've looked at the literature of this too much, but some people will like to, if they train first thing in the morning, they might like to jump in the cold water immersion as almost a form of kind of waking them up, kind of getting them going a little bit, and then going to kind of do their workout. So have you kind of looked at the literature at all with, doing cold water immersion before you kind of go train, and if that has any potential effects there?
I haven't looked at, I don't know how much literature there is about pre-training cold water immersion. I mean, sort of off the top of my head, I would expect that, muscles generally perform better when they're warmed up. And so even if you have the systemic shock of the cold water and you feel alert, that doesn't necessarily translate to, at the physiological level, and the muscles getting ready to fire, it doesn't necessarily translate to improved performance, or might not, I guess. That said, there is something to be said for being psychologically ready. So if that helps, there may be some benefit there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think there's plenty of research suggesting that a warmer body temperature helps facilitate muscle contraction and kind of different things going on there. So if you've kind of cooled your body temperature by a significant degree, I don't know why I can't talk today, and then you jump right into your training session, I would definitely, it wouldn't surprise me if there was some sort of negative effect when it comes to performance there. Now, you could probably ameliorate that to some degree by having a proper warm-up and stuff like that, but then, that you're looking at the time constraints of, okay, do a cold water immersion for 15 minutes, warming up for 15 to 20 minutes, and then you're at the gym for 35, 40 minutes, and you haven't even done a set yet. So there's also those considerations as well. So kind of with that, Alec, what's kind of next for you? I've asked this question to a lot of the other guys. I feel like I've interviewed, the entire crew leaving college at this point. So what's kind of next for you? Do you have any kind of studies that you're working on, or any areas of interest for you currently?
So we've got the lab is running Ryan Burke, who I think has been with you. So he's running a cool study now in the lab. We're looking at different muscle growth training strategies. So within subjects, training one side of their body one way, the other side the other way. So working on that. Also looking forward to planning on conducting my thesis in the spring, looking at post-activation performance enhancement. Which looking forward to a lot. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I'll definitely be on the lookout for those. I'll definitely have to have Ryan on once he concludes that study. I know this stuff is definitely a process. It takes a long time. But yeah, that's awesome, man. And best of luck with your kind of thesis coming up here and not too long. I know that I personally haven't gone. I did a thesis for my master's, but is it for your kind of PhD? Is that what your thesis is for?
The master's for me too, yeah.
Do you have plans to go on to do a PhD, or are you calling it good at master's? I know when I was done with my master's, I was like, all right, I've had enough of this. I'm ready to be out. Or where are you kind of at with that?
Yeah, I was out of school for a while before I decided to come back for my master's. And one of the reasons I chose this program was because of the research opportunities. I've loved it so far. So I think PhD that's going to be next steps for me.
All right. Well, there we go. Well, I'll definitely be paying attention to what you're doing. And if people want to kind of also pay attention to what you're doing? Is there anywhere that they can kind of go to follow you or follow the research you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at Beijing Tales. Most of my stuff is on there.
Awesome. Well, I'll definitely have that linked in the description as well. So thank you so much for coming on today, Alec, and kind of sharing what you did for your study. I think we definitely nailed the big takeaways of it. So I definitely appreciate that.
Thank you for having me.